Our next guest is Congressman Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin. He served for 7 years in the United States Marine Corps and deployed twice to Iraq. In addition to that, he has a PhD in international relations. Now, before leaving for France, President Trump told Reuters he wasn't aware his son met with a Russian lawyer until just a few days ago. Congressman, you have been very vocal about the relationship between the White House and Russia. What do you make of this latest revelation?
Well, I think it's serious, and I think before tearing each other apart, let's recognize that 3 investigations are underway. We have one in the House, one in the Senate. We obviously have the special investigation being led by Robert Mueller, and I think let's allow that to proceed. Let's get all the facts. What I've said from the beginning is we want the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Let the facts and the truth set us free. But I think looking more broadly, we need to be very, very wary about the Russians and recognize that Putin does not share our long-term interests. The Russians have launched an influence campaign against our own democracy, corresponding with cyber attacks that they've launched around the world. They've invaded a sovereign country, redrawn the borders of Europe at gunpoint for the first time since World War II. They don't share our interest in the Middle East. They've repeatedly violated and crossed our red lines in Syria and more broadly. So I think it's a fantasy to believe that we can work with the Russians. I think any grand bargain with the Russians on counterterrorism cooperation would be short-sighted and would cede a Russian and Iranian sphere of influence in the Middle East. That would be disastrous for our own interests, disastrous for our allies, and ultimately make our homeland less secure.
You've called for the House to pass legislation on economic sanctions against Russia and that the Senate did pass. What impact would these sanctions have on our relationship with Russia?
Well, listen, I think the Senate passed it 98-2, so it's incumbent upon the House to act now. And it's not just Russia sanctions, these are Iranian sanctions as well. We know that the Iranians continue their support for terrorist groups around the world. They're the leading state sponsor of terrorism. They continue to meddle in Syria. They threaten our closest ally in the Middle East, Israel, with an expanding ballistic missile program in contravention of no less than 6 UN Security Council resolutions. So I think it's perfectly fair to pass enhanced sanctions on Iran for this illicit and dangerous activity. And there are many of us who believe that Iran is also in violation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and we need to enforce it more strongly. So I think there's a strong case to be made. As for how it affects our relations with the Russians, what the Russians respond to more than anything else is strength, not weakness. For too long now, for the last 8 years, we've shown nothing but weakness, and the Russians have continued to test our limits. So my concern is that when we show greater weakness, when we have a ceasefire in one part of Syria, it allows the Russians and the Iranians to regroup and move their shock troops to other parts of the country and actually gain more territory. And we saw that time and again in the last administration, and we cannot repeat those same mistakes. We have to be willing to stand up, and it starts in the House with sanctions.
Are you saying then that the ceasefire is not a good idea?
I'm thinking that we need to be very, very careful. Let's evaluate the ceasefire. In the past, whenever Assad has agreed to a ceasefire, this is more directly between us and the Russians, there's been violations of it. There's also been reports in the last 24 hours that they've violated. If the ceasefire means that we are ceding a sphere of influence to Russia and Iran, then yes, it is a very bad idea, because the longer term threat, ISIS is the urgent threat we face in Syria, and we cannot allow it to have a caliphate. We cannot allow it to have a terrorist safe haven in the heart of the Middle East. But in many ways, Iran is the more pressing and longer term threat. Iran is a greater threat to all our allies in the region. And as H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, said the other week, something like 70% of the pro-regime forces on the ground in Syria are actually Iranian-backed militias and Iranian-backed terrorist groups like Hezbollah. Hezbollah presents an enormous threat to Israel and has made significant advances in its missile capability. So we have to orient our Syria policy as well as our broader regional policy along the lines of rolling back Iranian influence and making sure that it doesn't develop a nuclear capability, which this deal will allow it to do in 10 years if we don't reverse the disastrous terms of the deal. And so if the ceasefire means that we are going to continue the mistakes of the past and allow Russia and Iran to establish an axis of influence around the Middle East, then we should rethink it, and we should be clear-eyed about who we're dealing with in Moscow.
Thank you for your time, Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin.